December 7th, 1943. General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, received word from President Franklin Roosevelt in Washington. Roosevelt had just returned from the Tehran Conference, where he had met with Churchill and Stalin. The message was clear. Roosevelt had made his decision about who would command the invasion of France. The choice would determine how the war ended. How many Americans would die in France? How many months the fighting would last? Whether Soviet tanks would stop at Berlin or roll to the English Channel. Marshall understood the weight of what was being decided. This wasn't just about selecting a commander. This was about choosing between military efficiency and political necessity, between the general who could win fastest and the general who could hold the alliance together. For months, everyone had assumed Marshall himself would get the job. He was the obvious choice. As Army Chief of Staff since 1939, he had built the American military from 200,000 men into a force of millions. He had planned the global strategy, selected the commanders, and coordinated operations across 2 oceans and 3 continents. Churchill called him the organizer of victory. The invasion of France was the culmination of everything Marshall had built. Roosevelt wanted Marshall to have the command, but Roosevelt also knew he couldn't spare Marshall from Washington. The global war effort depended on Marshall's strategic oversight and his ability to manage the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As Roosevelt told Marshall, "I didn't feel I could sleep at ease if you were out of Washington." So the choice fell to Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower. He was currently serving as Allied commander in the Mediterranean. He had never commanded troops in combat before 1942. He had spent World War I training troops in Pennsylvania. His entire career had been staff work, planning, and political coordination, but he was cautious, diplomatic, skilled at managing egos and building consensus. Roosevelt's decision shocked many officers. What about Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., who was commanding the 7th Army in Sicily? Patton had an exceptional combat record. He had saved the North African campaign after the Kasserine Pass disaster. He had taken Palermo in 38 days when British commanders said it would take months. He had won every major battle in North Africa and Sicily. His troops called him Old Blood and Guts and would follow him into hell. German commanders feared him more than any other Allied general. But Patton wasn't even considered for a supreme Allied commander. He wasn't in the conversation. He wasn't on the list. Despite being America's most successful battlefield commander, despite his tactical genius, despite his proven ability to win battles faster than anyone else, George Patton was too politically toxic to be trusted with coalition command. This wasn't because of the slapping incidents that would become public weeks later. This was because Marshall, Eisenhower, and Roosevelt all knew something the American public didn't. Patton could win battles brilliantly, but he couldn't manage allies. He couldn't control his mouth. He couldn't subordinate his ego to diplomatic necessity. He saw coalition warfare as a competition where American forces should dominate and British forces should follow. He treated war correspondents as tools for personal publicity. He said offensive things about allies without considering consequences. Patton was an operational genius. But supreme command required more than operational genius. It required managing Churchill's pride and de Gaulle's ego. It required building consensus among officers who disagreed about strategy. It required making suboptimal military decisions to preserve coalition unity. Patton couldn't do any of this. He didn't want to do any of this. He resented having to do any of this. So Roosevelt chose Eisenhower. And Patton would spend the war executing other people's plans instead of making his own. He would command armies brilliantly within strategic frameworks others established. He would prove repeatedly that his aggressive tactics could have ended the war faster. But he would never have the authority to shape grand strategy. Roosevelt and Marshall had made a political calculation. They chose the commander who could manage the coalition over the commander who could win battles fastest. And that calculation would cost thousands of American lives over the next 18 months. This is the story of why George S. Patton, Jr., the greatest American battlefield commander of World War II, was never even considered for supreme command. Not because he couldn't win battles, but because winning the war required more than winning battles. It required coalition politics. And Patton was incapable of understanding that political compromises would take priority over military effectiveness. To understand why Patton was passed over, you have to understand who George Patton was. Not the Hollywood version, the real man, and the real problem he created for the Army's leadership. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born in 1885 into a wealthy California family with deep military roots. He attended West Point and graduated in 1909 with a reputation as an aggressive, competitive officer who believed war was mankind's highest calling. In World War I, Patton commanded tanks and was one of the first American officers to understand mechanized warfare. Between the wars, Patton studied military history obsessively. He read everything written about Napoleon, Hannibal, Caesar, Alexander. He believed he understood warfare at a level his contemporaries didn't. He believed he had been reincarnated from previous warriors and had fought at Carthage and Troy. He told people this. He believed it absolutely. His personality was complicated. He was profane and quotable. He wore custom uniforms with polished boots and ivory-handled revolvers. He demanded perfection from his troops and drove them harder than any other American commander. He was theatrical and knew it. He cultivated an image as a warrior poet who loved battle. He was also deeply insecure. He had severe dyslexia and struggled with reading throughout his life. He compensated by memorizing everything. He studied obsessively because reading was difficult for him. The aggressive persona was partly real and partly constructed to hide his learning disability and his fear that other officers saw him as intellectually inferior. By 1942, when America entered World War II, Patton was 57 years old. He had spent 33 years in the Army, training officers in armored warfare and writing doctrine manuals for tank combat. He understood mobile warfare better than any American commander, and he was absolutely convinced that he was destined for greatness. The problem was that Patton couldn't control himself. He said what he thought. He insulted allies. He ignored orders he disagreed with. He leaked information to reporters to build his public image. He treated war correspondents as tools for his publicity. He competed with other generals for headlines and glory. Most importantly, Patton had no understanding of coalition politics. He didn't care about British sensitivities. He didn't care about Free French pride. He didn't care about Soviet demands for a second front. He cared about killing Germans efficiently and winning battles decisively. Everything else was politics, and politics bored him. Marshall knew all of this. Eisenhower knew it too. They had worked with Patton for decades. They knew he was brilliant on the battlefield and catastrophic in a headquarters. They knew he would win battles and lose allies. They knew he was the best combat commander America had and the worst possible choice for a position requiring diplomatic skill. So they made a decision. Use Patton where his strengths mattered. Keep him away from situations where his weaknesses could destroy the alliance. Give him armies to command. Never give him theaters to manage. It was a rational calculation based on Patton's demonstrated behavior, but it was also a decision that would haunt American strategy for the rest of the war. In November 1942, Patton got his first combat command of the war. He led the Western Task Force in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. His forces landed at Casablanca in Morocco, while British and American forces landed further east at Oran and Algiers. The Casablanca landing was complicated. Vichy French forces were defending Morocco, and the political situation was delicate. Roosevelt didn't want to alienate French forces who might join the Allies. Patton was ordered to minimize casualties and avoid excessive force. Patton ignored the political concerns and focused on military objectives. He hit the beaches hard and overwhelmed French resistance in 4 days. Casablanca fell. French forces in Morocco surrendered. Patton established himself as the American commander who got results. But the real test came in March 1943. American forces in Tunisia had been badly beaten at Kasserine Pass. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had smashed through American lines and exposed the inexperience of U.S. troops in combat against Wehrmacht veterans. American casualties were heavy. Morale was shattered. Allied commanders were questioning whether American forces could fight effectively. Eisenhower needed someone to restore order and confidence. He sent Patton to take command of Second Corps. Patton arrived on March 6, 1943, and immediately transformed the unit. He enforced uniform regulations. He demanded discipline. He court-martialed officers for cowardice. He personally visited frontline positions and fired commanders who weren't aggressive enough. Within 2 weeks, Second Corps was a different army. Patton led them in attacks at El Ghoutar, where they stopped a German counterattack and inflicted heavy casualties. American troops stopped retreating and started winning. Patton had proven that American soldiers could fight. They just needed aggressive leadership. But Patton didn't just win tactically. He won psychologically. He restored American pride after the humiliation of Kasserine. He showed British commanders that American forces could hold their own against German veterans. He demonstrated that speed and aggression could overcome Wehrmacht tactical superiority. Marshall and Eisenhower took note. Patton was proving himself invaluable as a battlefield commander, but the North Africa campaign also revealed the political problem with Patton. He competed with British commanders for glory. He resented taking orders from Eisenhower. He gave unauthorized interviews to reporters. He complained about supply allocations. He made it clear he thought he should be in command of the entire North African theater. Eisenhower had to manage Patton constantly. He had to smooth over conflicts with British officers. He had to explain away Patton's public statements. He had to balance Patton's tactical brilliance against the diplomatic headaches he created. Still, the results were undeniable. Patton had taken a defeated, demoralized corps and turned it into an effective fighting force in 2 weeks. When North Africa fell in May 1943, Patton's reputation as America's best combat commander was established. The question was what to do with him next. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 8th Army. Eisenhower commanded the overall operation. The strategic goal was to secure Sicily, knock Italy out of the war, and prepare for the eventual invasion of France. The plan gave Montgomery the main route north to Messina. Patton's forces were assigned a supporting role protecting Montgomery's left flank. It was a conservative plan designed to let the experienced British forces lead while American forces learned. Patton hated it. He saw it as British arrogance and Eisenhower's unwillingness to trust American forces with the main effort. He decided to ignore the spirit of his orders and race Montgomery to Messina. If he got there first, he would prove American forces were superior to British forces and establish himself as the dominant Allied commander. Patton drove his troops relentlessly. He advanced up the western coast of Sicily, while Montgomery's forces got bogged down in the east. Patton took Palermo in rapid succession. He pushed his divisions forward with minimal rest. He accepted higher casualties to maintain speed. And on August 17, 1943, Patton's forces entered Messina hours before Montgomery arrived. It was a stunning tactical achievement. Patton had covered more ground, fought more battles, and reached the objective first. He had upstaged Montgomery and made American arms look superior to British forces. American newspapers celebrated him as a hero. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was the face of American military success. But the Sicily campaign also revealed Patton's recklessness. He had pushed troops beyond their physical limits. His casualty rates were higher than necessary because he prioritized speed over careful planning. He had created a competition with Montgomery that strained the alliance. And worst of all, his aggressive driving of tired troops created the conditions for the incidents that would nearly end his career. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia. He was touring the facility and talking to wounded soldiers. He approached Private Charles Cool, who was sitting on a bed with no visible wounds. Patton asked what was wrong. Cool said he couldn't take the shelling anymore. Patton exploded. He called Cool a coward. He slapped him across the face with his gloves. He pulled his pistol and threatened to shoot him. He ordered Cool back to the front lines immediately. Medical staff had to intervene to prevent Patton from shooting a soldier suffering from combat fatigue. 1 week later, August 10th, Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. He encountered Private Paul Bennett, who was also suffering from combat fatigue with no visible injuries. Patton repeated the performance. He slapped Bennett. He called him a coward. He drew his pistol. He had Bennett thrown out of the hospital tent. The incidents were witnessed by dozens of medical personnel and reported up the chain of command. Eisenhower learned about them within days. War correspondents knew about them but agreed not to publish the stories temporarily while Eisenhower decided what to do. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. Patton had just won the Sicily campaign and was the most successful American commander in the theater. But he had assaulted soldiers suffering from psychological wounds and had violated every principle of military justice and medical care. By regulations, Patton should have been court-martialed and relieved of command. Eisenhower made a political calculation. He privately reprimanded Patton and ordered him to apologize to the soldiers, the medical staff, and every division in 7th Army. But he did not relieve Patton of command. He did not court-martial him. He kept Patton in theater because he believed he needed him for the invasion of France. The decision became public in November 1943 when radio commentator Drew Pearson broke the story on his broadcast on November 21st. The American public was outraged. Congressmen demanded Patton be fired. Veterans organizations called for his court-martial. The Secretary of War was flooded with letters demanding Patton be held accountable. But by then, Eisenhower had made his recommendation for Supreme Commander, and he had included Patton in his plans for France. Not as Supreme Commander, as an Army commander under Eisenhower's direction. Because Eisenhower believed Patton's tactical genius was worth tolerating his character flaws. Marshall agreed with Eisenhower's assessment. Patton was too valuable to lose. But he was also too dangerous to promote beyond Army command. The slapping incidents gave Marshall and Roosevelt public justification for what they already knew. They could point to his lack of judgment, his inability to control his temper, his disregard for military regulations. They could explain why Patton would never be trusted with anything beyond battlefield command. It was a convenient rationalization. The truth was that Patton's personality, his competitiveness, his inability to work within coalition politics. These had always disqualified him from theater command. Patton was never going to be considered for Supreme Allied Commander. The slapping incidents just gave everyone a public excuse for a decision that had already been made based on who Patton was. So why did Roosevelt choose Eisenhower over keeping Marshall in the field? And why was Patton never even in the conversation? The answer to the first question was strategic necessity. Marshall was indispensable in Washington. He managed the global war effort. He coordinated with the British. He oversaw operations in both Europe and the Pacific. He worked with Congress on appropriations and mobilization. Roosevelt literally told him, "I didn't feel I could sleep at ease if you were out of Washington." Marshall was too important to the overall war effort to be tied down, commanding one theater. That left Eisenhower as the logical choice among the remaining generals. He had never commanded troops in combat before 1942. He had spent World War I as a training officer at Camp Colt in Pennsylvania. He had spent the interwar years doing staff work for Douglas MacArthur and serving in various administrative positions. He was smart, competent, and well-regarded. But he had no combat experience before North Africa. What Eisenhower had was political skill. He understood how to manage British commanders who resented American authority. He understood how to balance competing demands from Churchill and Roosevelt. He was patient, diplomatic, and willing to compromise American tactical advantages to keep allies happy. What he didn't have was Patton's killer instinct. He didn't have Patton's understanding of how to use speed and aggression to end battles quickly. He didn't have Patton's ability to read terrain and exploit opportunities faster than the enemy could react. These were military skills. Eisenhower's skills were political. What Patton lacked was everything Eisenhower had. Patton saw coalition warfare as a competition where American forces should dominate. He competed with British commanders for glory instead of building partnerships. He leaked information to build his own reputation. He said offensive things about allies without considering diplomatic consequences. He was incapable of subordinating his ego to accomplish political objectives. This is why Patton was never considered for Supreme Allied Commander, even before the slapping incidents. Marshall and Roosevelt knew that Supreme Command required more than battlefield genius. It required political sophistication that Patton completely lacked. Eisenhower had proven this in North Africa. He had managed the fractious relationship between American and British commanders. He had dealt with de Gaulle and the Free French. He had coordinated land, air, and naval operations across multiple theaters. He had done this without alienating allies or creating diplomatic incidents. Marshall valued this more than combat experience. The invasion of France would require coordinating millions of troops from multiple nations across hundreds of miles of front. It would require managing air forces, navies, supply systems, intelligence services. It would require maintaining unity of command while respecting national sovereignty and pride. Eisenhower could do this. Patton could not. Patton saw coalition warfare as a competition where American forces should dominate and British forces should follow. Eisenhower saw it as a partnership where egos had to be managed and compromises had to be made. The question nobody asked was whether those compromises would cost American lives. Roosevelt agreed with Marshall's assessment. FDR was thinking about post-war politics. He knew the United States would emerge from the war as a superpower. He knew maintaining the British alliance would be essential. He knew that offending Churchill or de Gaulle during the war would complicate post-war relationships. Patton was a political liability. Eisenhower was politically safe. He said the right things. He built bridges instead of burning them. He understood that winning the war required more than tactical victories. It required maintaining coalition unity through victory and into the post-war order. The question was whether keeping Montgomery happy mattered more than saving American lives, whether alliance unity justified giving fuel to British operations that would fail while American forces that were succeeding ran dry, whether political compromise was more important than military effectiveness. So Marshall recommended Eisenhower. Roosevelt approved and announced he would keep Marshall in Washington, where he was irreplaceable. And on Christmas Eve, 1943, Eisenhower was officially appointed Supreme Allied Commander for Operation Overlord. Patton would command the Third Army under Bradley, who would command the 12th Army Group under Eisenhower. Patton would execute operational plans made by others. He would fight brilliantly within the strategic framework Eisenhower established. But he would never have the authority to shape grand strategy. The announcement was made public in early January 1944. Newspapers praised Eisenhower's appointment. Military analysts noted his diplomatic skills and organizational ability. Some questioned his lack of combat experience. Nobody asked whether political reliability mattered more than battlefield excellence. Nobody asked how many Americans would die because alliance politics took priority over military effectiveness. Patton was not mentioned in the announcement. His role in the invasion was kept secret for operational security reasons. But inside the Army, everyone understood the reality. The best American combat commander would never be trusted with coalition command. His tactical genius was invaluable. His political toxicity was disqualifying. Marshall and Roosevelt had decided that managing the alliance mattered more than maximizing battlefield efficiency. Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944. American forces, led by General Omar Bradley's First Army, broke through German lines at St. Lo. After 6 weeks of bloody stalemate in the Normandy hedgerows, the American forces finally achieved a breakthrough. The German defensive line collapsed, and suddenly there was open country ahead. Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944. His mission was to exploit the Cobra breakthrough. He was supposed to advance into Brittany to capture ports for Allied logistics. It was a conservative plan designed to secure supply lines before pushing deeper into France. Patton looked at the strategic situation and immediately recognized that the plan was obsolete. The German forces in Normandy were broken. Their western flank was collapsing. Paris was vulnerable. The path to the German border was open. Capturing Breton ports would take weeks and wouldn't matter if the war ended before the ports were needed. Patton made a command decision. He would comply with the letter of his orders, but not the spirit. He sent one corps into Brittany to capture the ports, but he sent the rest of Third Army east toward Paris and the German frontier. He was gambling that by the time Eisenhower realized what he was doing, Patton would have advanced so far that changing the plan would be impossible. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Patton's forces advanced over 400 miles in 2 weeks. They liberated Le Mans, Chartres, and Orléans. They reached the Seine River and threatened Paris from the south. They pushed German forces into retreat and captured thousands of prisoners. It was the most rapid advance in American military history. But Patton's advance also created problems. His supply lines were stretched dangerously thin. His tanks were running low on fuel. His logistics officers warned that he was outrunning his supplies and would have to stop to let the supply system catch up. Patton ignored them. He told his commanders to keep advancing until they ran out of gas, then to figure out how to get more gas and keep going. On August 15th, Patton received orders to halt at the Seine River and wait for other Allied forces to catch up. Patton found a loophole. He ordered reconnaissance in-force patrols across the Seine. Those patrols kept expanding. By the time Eisenhower's headquarters questioned what he was doing, Patton's entire army was across the river conducting reconnaissance. It was aggressive gamesmanship with orders, not outright disobedience. But the effect was the same. He kept advancing when he was supposed to stop. By August 31st, Third Army had reached the Meuse River, nearly 250 miles beyond where they were supposed to be. Patton had advanced faster than any army in history. He had liberated huge sections of France. He had destroyed multiple German divisions. And he had made a mockery of the careful, methodical plan Eisenhower's staff had drawn up. Eisenhower was furious. Patton had disobeyed orders. He had disrupted the entire Allied logistics system by consuming fuel and supplies that were allocated to other armies. He had advanced so far that his flanks were exposed and he couldn't be adequately supplied. Bradley, who was technically Patton's superior, had lost control of him. But Eisenhower couldn't punish Patton, because Patton's advance had been brilliantly successful. German forces in France were collapsing. Paris had been liberated. The Allied advance had shortened the war by months. Patton had taken risks that violated doctrine and had gotten away with it, because the risks paid off. This was exactly why Marshall and Roosevelt had never considered Patton for supreme command. Patton was willing to ignore orders he disagreed with. He prioritized victory over obedience. He made strategic gambles without authorization. These qualities made him a brilliant army commander. They made him completely unsuitable for theater command. Because if Patton had been in Eisenhower's position, with the authority to make strategic decisions for the entire theater, his aggressive instincts would have created disasters alongside victories. He would have ignored political constraints. He would have alienated allies. He would have taken risks that could have fractured the coalition. Eisenhower understood this. He valued Patton as a subordinate, but would have feared him as an equal. The Third Army's breakout proved that Patton needed someone above him imposing limits and making him operate within strategic constraints. By early September 1944, Allied forces were running out of fuel. The logistics system was breaking down. Armies were advancing faster than supplies could follow. Eisenhower faced a critical decision: which armies would get the limited fuel available, and which would have to halt. Patton wanted the fuel. He argued that Third Army was closest to the German border. He could reach the Rhine River within days if he had adequate supplies. He could cross into Germany proper and threaten the Ruhr industrial region. He believed he could end the war before winter. Montgomery also wanted the fuel. He argued that British forces in the north should receive priority. He proposed Operation Market Garden, an airborne assault to capture bridges across the Rhine in Holland. He believed this would outflank German defenses and allow British forces to drive into northern Germany. Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, supported Patton. He argued that Third Army's momentum should be maintained. He believed Patton's aggressive leadership gave him the best chance of breaking German resistance before it could solidify. Eisenhower chose to support Montgomery. He gave the British 21st Army Group priority for fuel and supplies. He approved Market Garden. He ordered American forces, including Patton's Third Army, to slow their advance and consolidate their positions. Eisenhower's decision was not based on military logic. Market Garden was a high-risk operation that required everything to go perfectly. Patton's advance, while aggressive, was working and had momentum. Eisenhower's decision was political. Churchill was pressuring Roosevelt to give British forces a larger role in the final victory. British public opinion was growing frustrated with American dominance of the campaign. Montgomery was threatening to resign if he didn't receive priority, and Eisenhower believed maintaining alliance unity was more important than optimal military strategy. Patton was ordered to halt Third Army's advance. He protested vigorously. He argued that stopping now would allow the Germans to regroup and extend the war. He told Eisenhower that with adequate fuel, he could be in Berlin before the Soviets. He predicted that giving Montgomery the resources would lead to disaster. Eisenhower overruled him. Third Army received minimal fuel and was ordered to conduct limited operations, while Montgomery prepared Market Garden. Patton complained to reporters. He leaked information suggesting that political pressure was overriding military judgment. He made it clear he believed the decision was wrong. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. It failed disastrously. British airborne forces were surrounded at Arnhem. Thousands were killed or captured. The operation gained no strategic advantage. Montgomery's reputation was damaged, and the fuel and supplies that could have supported Patton's advance were wasted on a failed operation. But the real cost wasn't measured in British casualties at Arnhem. It was measured in the American soldiers who died fighting through the Siegfried Line in October and November, because Patton hadn't been allowed to outflank it in September. It was measured in the extended war that gave Germany time to prepare the Ardennes offensive. Eisenhower's political decision to support Montgomery had bought temporary alliance harmony. The price was American lives and months of additional combat. Patton believed this vindicated his argument. If he had been given supreme command, he would have prioritized Third Army's advance. He would have reached the German border weeks earlier. He would have crossed the Rhine before German defenses solidified. The war might have ended in 1944. But Marshall and Eisenhower saw it differently. They believed that if Patton had been supreme commander, he would have created even bigger problems. He would have ignored British sensitivities. He would have competed with Montgomery instead of managing him. He would have fractured the alliance in pursuit of American glory. The failure of Market Garden didn't prove that Patton should have been supreme commander. It proved that Eisenhower wasn't aggressive enough and was too willing to let politics override military judgment. But it also proved that someone had to manage coalition politics, and Patton wasn't capable of doing it. In August 1944, German forces in Normandy were trapped in a pocket near the town of Falaise. Allied forces had surrounded them on three sides. The only escape route was a narrow gap to the east. If the Allies closed the gap, they could capture or destroy 100,000 German troops and end organized German resistance in France. Bradley commanded American forces approaching from the south. Montgomery commanded British and Canadian forces approaching from the north. The plan was for both forces to advance and close the gap, trapping the Germans inside. Patton's Third Army was positioned perfectly to close the gap from the south. He requested permission from Bradley to advance north and seal the pocket completely. He argued that he could reach Falaise before the Germans escaped and turn the Normandy campaign into a complete destruction of German forces in France. Bradley refused. He was concerned that if Patton advanced too far north, American and British forces might accidentally fire on each other. He was worried about coordination problems. He was afraid of creating a friendly fire incident that would embarrass the alliance. Patton argued that the risk was worth it. The opportunity to destroy the German Seventh Army was too valuable to let slip away because of coordination concerns. He told Bradley that careful fire control could prevent friendly fire casualties. He pleaded to be allowed to advance. Bradley held firm. He stopped Patton's advance at Argentan, about 15 miles short of Falaise. He ordered Patton to halt and wait for Montgomery's forces to close the gap from the north. Patton obeyed the order but protested vehemently. He believed Bradley was throwing away a historic opportunity because he was afraid of upsetting Montgomery. Montgomery's forces advanced slowly toward Falaise. Canadian troops were fighting hard but making limited progress. German resistance was stiffening as they realized they needed to keep the escape route open. Days passed. The gap remained open. Finally, on August 19th, Allied forces linked up at Chambois, partially closing the gap. But German forces kept forcing openings in the next 2 days. The pocket wasn't fully sealed until August 21st. By then, significant German forces had escaped. Between 20,000 and 50,000 German troops got out of the pocket. They escaped with much of their equipment. They retreated east and formed the nucleus of new defensive positions. Those weren't just numbers on a casualty report. Those were SS panzer crews who would defend the Siegfried Line, Wehrmacht infantry who would fight at Hürtgen Forest, the experienced soldiers who would spearhead the Ardennes offensive 3 months later. Every German who walked out of the Falaise pocket would be killing Americans through the winter. Patton knew this. Bradley knew this. They let them go anyway because coordinating with Montgomery mattered more than destroying the enemy. Historians debate whether Patton could have closed the gap if he had been allowed to advance. The argument for letting him try is strong. Third Army was positioned perfectly. Patton's forces were experienced and aggressive. The risk of friendly fire, while real, was manageable with proper coordination. The decision not to let Patton close the gap reflected the coalition politics that Marshall had used to justify not giving Patton supreme command. Bradley was afraid of creating problems with Montgomery. He prioritized avoiding embarrassment over maximizing military effectiveness. He made a politically safe decision that let German forces escape. If Patton had been supreme commander, he would have closed the gap. He would have accepted the risk of friendly fire. He would have told Montgomery to coordinate his advance instead of waiting for permission. He would have prioritized destroying German forces over protecting British pride. But Patton wasn't supreme commander. He was an army commander under Bradley. And Bradley was cautious and political in ways Patton wasn't. So the Germans escaped. The war continued. And thousands of Americans died in subsequent battles, fighting German troops that could have been captured at Falaise. Patton believed this was another example of what happened when political considerations overrode military judgment. He believed that if Marshall had given him supreme command, the war would have ended faster and with fewer American casualties. He was probably right. But he also would have fractured the alliance and created diplomatic crises that would have complicated the post-war order. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front. They attacked through the Ardennes forest, hitting thinly defended American positions. The assault surprised Allied intelligence completely. Within days, German forces had advanced 50 miles and created a massive bulge in the Allied lines. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. Bradley, Patton, and other senior commanders attended. The situation was desperate. German forces were surrounding the town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was trapped. American forces were retreating in confusion. The entire Allied front was threatened. Eisenhower asked his commanders how quickly they could respond. Most said they needed days or weeks to reorganize their forces and prepare a counterattack. The situation was too chaotic. The weather was terrible. Moving large forces in winter conditions would take time. Patton said he could attack within 48 hours. Everyone in the room thought he was insane. Third Army was 100 miles south of the battle. Patton would have to disengage from current operations, turn his entire army 90 degrees north, move through winter storms, and launch a coordinated attack. It seemed impossible. Patton explained that he had anticipated the possibility of needing to respond quickly. He had his staff prepare contingency plans for moving Third Army north. He had 3 complete attack plans ready depending on where Eisenhower wanted him to strike. All he needed was the order. Eisenhower gave the order. Patton left the meeting and immediately put his plan into motion. Third Army began disengaging from operations in eastern France, turning north and moving through snow and ice toward the German salient. And on December 22nd, exactly 3 days after the Verdun meeting, Patton's forces attacked the southern flank of the German Bulge. It was one of the most impressive operational movements in military history. Patton moved 3 divisions, approximately 133,000 men, over 100 miles in winter conditions, and launched a coordinated attack with minimal preparation time. His forces relieved Bastogne on December 26th. They drove back German forces and eliminated the threat to the Allied front. The speed and effectiveness of Patton's response shocked everyone. German commanders couldn't believe American forces could reorient so quickly. British observers called it a masterpiece of operational movement. Even Eisenhower, who frequently clashed with Patton, admitted it was one of the war's most impressive achievements. But the Battle of the Bulge also revealed what happened when Patton wasn't in command of overall strategy. The German offensive had succeeded because Allied intelligence failed to detect the buildup. Defensive positions were thinly manned because Eisenhower was spreading forces evenly across the front. Strategic reserves were inadequate because resources had been diverted to Montgomery's operations in the north. The result was 80,000 American casualties, 19,000 men killed in the snow, entire units overrun in their positions. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. These weren't acceptable losses in a calculated risk. These were preventable casualties that resulted from poor defensive preparation. Patton had warned about these problems. He had argued for concentrating forces and maintaining strong reserves. He had questioned the intelligence assessment saying Germany was finished. He had been ignored because Eisenhower and his staff believed they knew better. If Patton had been Supreme Commander, would the Bulge have happened? Probably not in the same way. Patton was paranoid about German counterattacks. He maintained strong reserves. He concentrated his forces instead of spreading them thin. He would have detected the German buildup, or at least been positioned to respond faster. But Patton's defensive strategy would have created other problems. He would have been less willing to give Montgomery resources. He would have pushed American forces harder and accepted higher casualties. He would have created friction with British commanders who resented his aggressive style. The Battle of the Bulge vindicated Patton's tactical instincts, but it also showed why Marshall and Roosevelt had never considered him for supreme command. Patton could execute brilliant operational movements. He couldn't manage a coalition, and managing the coalition was more important to American strategic interests than optimal military efficiency. By March 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing into Germany. The end of the war was approaching. But a new question emerged. Who would capture Berlin, and what would that mean for post-war politics? Soviet forces were advancing from the east. They were closer to Berlin than Western Allied forces. Stalin was determined to capture the German capital as a symbol of Soviet sacrifice and victory. Churchill wanted British and American forces to reach Berlin first to prevent Soviet domination of Central Europe. Patton was positioned to make a dash for Berlin. Third Army was advancing rapidly through central Germany. Patton believed he could reach Berlin before the Soviets if he was given the fuel and authorization to advance. In April 1945, Patton's Third Army reached the Elbe, only 50 miles from Berlin. The path was open. German resistance was collapsing. Patton was ready to advance. He had the option to push forward. Patton requested permission from Bradley and Eisenhower. He argued that American forces should reach Berlin before the Soviets. He believed occupation of the German capital would give the United States leverage in post-war negotiations. But Eisenhower chose not to antagonize Stalin. He prioritized the Soviet alliance over strategic position. He followed Roosevelt's agreements from Yalta, even though those agreements would give Stalin control of Eastern Europe. The decision had been made at the highest political levels. Political considerations won again. Patton was ordered to halt at the Elbe. He protested furiously. He argued that letting the Soviets take Berlin was a strategic mistake that would empower Soviet ambitions in Europe. He predicted that Stalin would dominate Eastern Europe and threaten Western interests. He believed American forces should occupy as much of Germany as possible before the final German surrender. Eisenhower ignored him. Patton's military judgment was less important than Roosevelt's diplomatic strategy. Third Army halted at the Elbe and waited while Soviet forces fought their way into Berlin. Patton believed this was the final proof that he should have been considered for supreme command. He argued that Eisenhower had been too willing to accommodate Soviet demands. He believed an American supreme commander should prioritize American strategic interests over maintaining alliance harmony with the Soviets. Marshall and Eisenhower saw it differently. They believed the decision to let the Soviets take Berlin was correct because fighting for Berlin would have cost thousands of American lives for no strategic gain. The city was going to be divided among the Allies anyway, based on pre-agreed occupation zones. Racing the Soviets for Berlin would have damaged the relationship Roosevelt and Churchill were trying to maintain. But Patton was right about one thing. The decision to halt at the Elbe allowed Stalin to consolidate control over Eastern Europe. Soviet forces occupied Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany. They imposed communist governments on populations that wanted freedom. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe exactly as Patton predicted. Whether American forces capturing Berlin would have changed this outcome is debatable. Stalin's control of Eastern Europe was based on military occupation, not symbolism. Soviet forces were on the ground. American forces would have had to fight them to prevent communist takeovers. Roosevelt and Churchill weren't willing to risk war with the Soviet Union immediately after defeating Germany. But Patton's instincts were strategically sound. He understood that the post-war order would be shaped by where military forces were positioned when the war ended. He wanted American forces as far east as possible to limit Soviet expansion. Eisenhower was willing to accept Soviet domination of Eastern Europe as the price of maintaining alliance unity. This difference in strategic vision was exactly why Patton was never considered for supreme command. Patton thought in military terms. Eisenhower thought in political terms. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted a supreme commander who would prioritize political objectives over military logic. After Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria. It was a political position requiring diplomatic skill and careful management of German civilians. It was exactly the wrong job for Patton. Patton immediately created controversies. He was slow to remove Nazi officials from administrative positions. He argued that experienced administrators were necessary to keep infrastructure running regardless of their political history. He said the Nazi Party was similar to Republican and Democratic parties in America, just German politics. These statements horrified American and British officials. The entire point of denazification was to remove Nazi influence from German society. Patton was treating Nazi Party membership as irrelevant. He was more concerned with efficient administration than with punishing Germans for supporting Hitler. Patton also advocated for rearming German forces to fight the Soviet Union. He told reporters that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy. He said we should have allied with Germany against the Soviets. He argued for immediate military confrontation with Stalin while American forces were at full strength in Europe. These statements violated official policy and embarrassed Eisenhower. The United States was trying to build cooperative relationships with the Soviet Union. Patton was advocating for World War III. He was calling for using German troops, the same forces that had just killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, against America's wartime ally. Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of Third Army and his position as military governor in October 1945. He gave Patton command of the 15th Army, a paper organization responsible for writing the history of the European campaign. It was a humiliating demotion. The Army's most successful combat commander was reduced to writing reports. Patton was bitter. He believed his removal proved that politicians punished honesty. He thought he was being persecuted for speaking truth about Soviet intentions. He felt vindicated by his combat record and betrayed by the political establishment. On December 9, 1945, Patton was injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His car collided with an Army truck. Patton suffered severe neck and spinal injuries that left him paralyzed from the neck down. He died on December 21, 1945, from complications related to his injuries. His death at age 60 meant he never had to witness the complete vindication of his warnings about Soviet intentions. The Cold War began within months of his death. Stalin imposed communist dictatorships across Eastern Europe exactly as Patton predicted. The Iron Curtain divided Europe for 45 years. The United States and Soviet Union faced off in a nuclear standoff that lasted until 1991. Patton had been right about Soviet intentions. His advocacy for confronting Stalin immediately after Germany's defeat was strategically sound, but his complete lack of political sophistication and diplomatic skill meant his warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a warmonger who couldn't accept that the war was over. If Patton had been given supreme command, his anti-Soviet attitudes would have created catastrophic diplomatic problems during the war. Roosevelt's strategy depended on maintaining Soviet cooperation against Germany. Patton would have jeopardized that cooperation by treating Stalin as an enemy rather than an ally. This is why Marshall and Roosevelt never considered Patton for supreme command. Not because Eisenhower was better at winning battles, but because Eisenhower understood that military victory had to serve political objectives. And the political objective was winning the war while maintaining alliance relationships that could be sustained into the post-war period. Patton couldn't do that. He was brilliant at tactical operations. He was catastrophic at coalition politics. He said what he thought without considering diplomatic consequences. He competed with allies instead of building partnerships. He prioritized military logic over political requirements. These qualities made him America's best Army commander. They also disqualified him from supreme command. The real lesson of why Patton was never even considered for supreme command is a bitter truth about coalition warfare. Military excellence matters less than political management. The best battlefield commander isn't always the right choice for theater command. Sometimes, the best battlefield commander isn't even in the conversation. Patton understood warfare at a level his contemporaries didn't. He studied military history obsessively. He grasped operational movement intuitively. He knew how to use speed and aggression to achieve decisive results. He was probably the best pure combat commander America produced in World War II. But Patton didn't understand politics. He didn't understand that wars are fought to achieve political objectives, not just to kill the enemy efficiently. He didn't understand that maintaining alliance relationships was as important as winning battles. He didn't understand that what you say to reporters matters as much as what you do on the battlefield. This made him unsuitable for supreme command despite his tactical brilliance. Supreme command requires balancing military requirements against political constraints. It requires managing egos and building consensus. It requires making suboptimal military decisions to preserve coalition unity. Patton couldn't do this. He didn't want to do this. He resented having to do this. Eisenhower understood coalition politics. He wasn't as talented a battlefield commander as Patton. He never would be. But he could work with Churchill without creating diplomatic incidents. He could coordinate with de Gaulle without insulting French pride. He could maintain Stalin's cooperation without provoking confrontation. These skills mattered more than tactical genius. Marshall understood this distinction. He knew Patton was the better warrior. But when Roosevelt asked who should command Overlord, Marshall recommended Eisenhower without hesitation. Because wars aren't won by warriors alone. They're won by coalitions that can sustain cooperation through victory and into the post-war order. And Patton was fundamentally incapable of coalition leadership. The American military system in World War II reflected this understanding. The United States never gave its best combat commanders supreme authority. MacArthur commanded the Pacific, but was subordinate to the Joint Chiefs. Patton commanded armies, but was subordinate to Eisenhower. The system was designed to ensure that political leaders controlled strategy while military commanders executed tactics. This frustrated aggressive commanders like Patton and MacArthur. They believed they understood warfare better than politicians and should be given freedom to pursue military victory without political constraints. They were probably right about understanding warfare better. They were certainly wrong about deserving freedom from political oversight. Because wars serve political purposes. Military force is a tool of national policy, not an end in itself. Commanders who forget this become dangerous. They pursue military objectives that contradict political goals. They create victories that lead to strategic defeats. Patton never understood this. He believed his job was to kill Germans efficiently and win battles decisively. Everything else was politics that didn't concern him. This attitude made him brilliant at executing missions. It ensured he would never be considered for positions that required defining strategy. Patton's tactical instincts were better than the cautious strategy Eisenhower pursued. The Normandy breakout was delayed by weeks because of cautious planning. The Falaise Gap failure allowed tens of thousands of German troops to escape. Market Garden consumed resources that could have supported Third Army's advance to the Rhine. The Battle of the Bulge happened because defensive positions were too thin and reserves were inadequate. The numbers tell the story that official histories try to obscure. Market Garden. 17,000 Allied casualties. No strategic gain. Resources that could have gone to Patton's advance went to Montgomery's failed operation instead. The Bulge. 80,000 American casualties. 19,000 men killed in the snow. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. These weren't acceptable losses. These were preventable casualties that happened because Eisenhower spread forces thin, trying to keep everyone happy. Hürtgen Forest. 33,000 American casualties taking Forest that could have been bypassed if Patton had been allowed to outflank the Siegfried Line in September. The Siegfried Line itself, taken by frontal assault in late 1944, because Patton hadn't been allowed to outflank it when it was still vulnerable in early September. Every one of those casualties has a name. Everyone has a family that received a War Department telegram. Everyone paid the price for political decisions that prioritized alliance unity over military effectiveness. Eisenhower kept the alliance together. That was his job, and he did it well. But his job wasn't to win battles quickly. His job wasn't to save American lives. His job was to manage egos and maintain coalition unity. He gave Montgomery fuel for Market Garden. He halted Patton at the Seine River. He stopped at the Elbe instead of racing for Berlin. Every one of those decisions kept allies happy. Every one of those decisions cost American lives. Patton's job was to win battles and destroy the enemy. He was the best in the world at it. And he was never even considered for supreme command because military effectiveness mattered less than political acceptability. Marshall chose the manager over the warrior. Roosevelt approved the choice. The alliance held together. Germany was defeated. The Soviets occupied Eastern Europe exactly as Patton predicted, and thousands of American soldiers paid the price. The Americans who died in the hedgerows, waiting for the breakout that was delayed by weeks, never got to vote on whether alliance unity was worth their lives. The families who opened War Department telegrams after the Bulge, after Market Garden, after Hurtgen Forest never got to decide whether keeping Montgomery happy justified their son's death. The soldiers paid in blood, the generals paid in reputation, the families paid in grief that never ended. George S. Patton, Jr. was never even in the conversation for supreme command because he was too good at war and too bad at politics. He could have ended the fighting sooner. But Marshall and Roosevelt chose the alliance over American lives. They chose political reliability over battlefield excellence. They never even considered giving Patton the authority to prove what aggressive leadership could achieve. That's the truth about coalition warfare. Political considerations cost lives, but leaders decide alliance unity matters more than individual casualties. And brilliant commanders who don't understand politics never get the chance to show what they could have accomplished. Patton spent the war subordinate to commanders he believed were inferior. He was probably right, but he was subordinate anyway because winning wars requires more than winning battles. It requires political compromises. And American soldiers pay the price for those compromises in blood.